Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David Ige.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Well, aloha and good Monday morning to you. I'm Yanji Denise, joined by Ryan Suji. This is Spotlight Hawaii on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Thanks so much for starting your week off with us. Ryan, today we have a guest who always gets a lot of questions.
That's right. We have a lot of different topics, and so we want to bring him in right now. Joining us is Senator Brian Schatz, joining us from his office here in Honolulu. He's in district. Thanks so much for joining us once again, Senator.
Nice to see you both.
All right. Well, we got a lot of topics to start to talk about, but we want to start off with Red Hill, the defueling efforts that's happening there. If you can give us an update on what you know, as well as the relationship and the conversations that you've had with Admiral Wade about this defueling effort.
Well, let me start with Admiral Wade. I think the really good news is that we finally have a person who is high-ranking, whose only job is to defuel Red Hill safely. Before, you had a bunch of commanders. First of all, you had a confusing sort of command structure. And then eventually you had, Admiral Sam Paparo and then Admiral Aquilino. These are people who have responsibility for preparing for potential hostilities in the Asia-Pacific region, who are also responsible for draining Red Hill. They were trying, but this is really a full-time enterprise, and he's going to be staffed up and focusing on that. So I think that's a really important first step. The unpacking, which is really just a fancy way of saying draining of the fuel pipes, was successfully completed last week. So that's a very important first step. And now we are sort of pressing the Department of Defense to accelerate their time frame and also get us a very hard cost estimate, because we're heading into the appropriations cycle. And I'm going to need to know how much money to put into the defense appropriations bill to get this thing done.
Have they given you a sense of how much money this is going to cost, at least a ballpark? And do you think that will get the funding it needs?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, we will get the money for defueling Red Hill. And they've been very cautious not to give us a sort of wild guess. They are doing as much in the way of due diligence as they possibly can. And I also think they're a little bit cautious now to say things that turn out not to be true, because that was the pattern over many, many years regarding Red Hill. So they're trying to be as precise as possible and make sure that when they tell us something that it's actually true. So I'm still waiting on that number, but we're anticipating we're going to be able to, assuming it's a reasonable number, put it in the next appropriations bill.
Something else that came out last week or in the past few weeks about the discussion about what happens with Red Hill after all of this is done is this closure in place plan of keeping the structure and the fuel facility intact. What is your thoughts about what the future of Red Hill should look like beyond this unpacking phase? And as we move towards a complete abandonment of this facility, what are your thoughts on what this facility should be used for in the future?
I don't have a strong feeling about that. And I'm a little worried that we're going to get ahead of ourselves and start thinking about what they're calling beneficial reuses of the facility. Look, the only thing I care about is draining Red Hill and making sure it doesn't pose a health or safety hazard for the people of Oahu or service members on base. So this next step about whether it's going to be, I guess I feel like that may be a conversation for later, but it could be a very expensive conversation. And so I'm looking at the least expensive, most safe option. The people of Oahu, I have not heard anybody being super passionate about what the beneficial reuses are of the facility. They're more concerned about get that darn petroleum out of there.
Absolutely. And you did mention timeline there. The last time the Navy was asked to sort of speed things up, it only shaved off a few months. And they said that really logistically that was difficult to do. Do you think that it's possible that they could take more time, that they could scale that back even further, given, what they've laid out as some of the challenges of doing this safely?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, and you framed the question exactly right, which is they need to do this as fast as they can, but still safely, right? We don't want them to rush so much that they skip any steps. But I will also say that the Department of Defense has a great history of being able to do things quickly in an emergency situation. And so the thing that I've communicated directly to Admiral Wade, but also to Secretary Austin, is this is an emergency. So the normal procurement process, the normal sort of bureaucratic tangles that are typical of any government contracting process just can't be tolerated. And so, yes, I think they can shave additional months, maybe even a year off the time frame, but I just don't know yet. And number one is safety, but a very, very close second is to do this as quickly as they possibly can.
I know we've had this discussion in the past, but one of the things that I just wanted to re-ask or see if there was an update on is just the overall conversation with leaders in the military about the relationship with Hawaii, knowing that it is an important part of our economy and just the important role the military plays. There are many in the community that continue to feel that this is not a partnership that's beneficial for the state in the long run, knowing of what happened with Red Hill and the transparency issues. Has this further been communicated to the military, to Admiral Wade, about the importance of this relationship and how we repair these ties and gaining trust of the people?
Well, that conversation has been with Secretary Austin, the Secretary of Defense, not so much with Admiral Wade, because Admiral Wade has a job. So he doesn't need to be, if you're an admiral and you get told that your only job is to head this joint task force and drain the tanks, then, you don't get to have a different view than that. And so I don't need to persuade him of the importance of that in terms of the relationship between DOD and the state of Hawaii. That's a conversation for the Secretary of Defense. And we've had that conversation where we say, look, all of these leases are coming up, and there are lots of live issues as it relates to Native Hawaiian equities, conservation, community input. To your point, some of these leases were very, very inexpensive to border on free. And I think the state is going to have to enter into a tough negotiation with the Department of Defense about the extension of these leases. But what I told them is, you're not even going to get in the room unless you drain Red Hill. You have to fulfill your end of the bargain, and then we can have a conversation about what is the overall relationship between the Department of Defense and the state of Hawaii and its people. But until you get this right, a lot of people are going to not even be interested in having the conversation.
I think that ties in really well with your work on the Indian Affairs Committee, serving as the chairman of that committee for some time now. Do you feel like the conversation has changed in terms of having more of a Native Hawaiian voice, in Washington and beyond? When you talk about these leases, that's what comes to my mind, is making sure that the people of Hawaii, and particularly the original landowners, have some say as to what happens to those leases as well.
Yeah, I think so. And, on the Indian Affairs Committee, we have elevated Native Hawaiian voices. About half of our committee hearings, a little more than half of our committee hearings, have had Native Hawaiians testifying either in person or via Zoom. And most importantly, because we are looking at generations and generations of injustice that cannot be reversed by, one law or one specific action. What I have learned is that when you talk to Native Hawaiian leaders and community members, what they want is investment to improve the lot of their community. And so we've invested a record amount in Native Hawaiian communities, more than the federal government has ever invested before. We have $90 million for internet connectivity, which is $90 million more than we've ever done. There's never been federal funds for Native Hawaiian internet connectivity, $25 million for Native Hawaiian climate adaptation, $124 million for the Native Hawaiian education program, $42 million for healthcare. And of course, the legislature really stepped up. And so I do think we're in a new era of not just paying lip service to the question of the original injustice, the overthrow, and how that has impacted generations of Native Hawaiians. But what do we actually do about it? What we can actually do about it is spend money in Native Hawaiian communities to make sure that education, healthcare, economic development, housing all has the resources that it needs.
I wonder if you can share a little more about the $25 million for the Native Hawaiian climate resiliency. We know that climate change is something that you are very passionate about. Can you explain a little bit more specifically about what that's going to do with regards to how it relates to Native Hawaiians?
Yeah, so this money is going to go to the Department of Interior, to the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations, and they have the authority under the law to determine who receives the money. And so it could be a not-for-profit, it could be a government agency. They have to apply. But the idea is very simple. Native communities across the country, in particular in Hawaii, but also American Indian reservations and Alaska Natives, are bearing the brunt of a lot of climate adaptation needs, whether it's coastal zones or aquifers that are getting worse or coral reefs that are getting worse. And so enabling these communities to use not just modern scientific techniques, but also some of the ancient knowledge of managing these resources to adapt to climate. You know, I talk a lot about the need to take action on climate in terms of transforming our energy system into a clean energy system. That's a key piece. But the other part is that climate change is already upon us and hurting people. And so we need to give communities the ability to adapt. But the DOI, the Department of Interior, is going to decide who gets the money and exactly for what.
You know, on climate, of course, COP27 has started, and I just would like to get your thoughts on the meeting of world leaders and what you're hoping that comes out of that. We hear, you know, this conference happens every year, and we hear a lot of people sounding the alarm, but the action piece does not seem to follow in the way that we wish it would.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone to a lot of these international climate meetings, and some are better than others. This one is a little funky because it's considered an implementation meeting. And so all these people from all over the world are actually focusing on implementation because, you know, before you had each individual country declaring their climate goals. We're going to cut, you know, our goal is to cut emissions 50% in the United States by the year 2030. And because of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're actually well on our way, 80% of the way to do that by the projections. But lots and lots of countries have made lots and lots of big promises. And now it's where the rubber hits the road. You've got to actually site clean energy. You've got to build clean energy. You've got to connect clean energy to the grid. You've got to enable families to save money by implementing clean energy in their household. So this is an implementation COP, a Conference of Parties UN meeting. And I'm pretty sure there will be no new big announcements, but just to focus on, okay, you've all promised this. How are you actually going to get there?
Switching gears to another topic that continues to make headlines is the rail. Last week, we were able to speak with HART Board Chair Colleen Hanabusa on this program. She talked a little more about the cracks that they're finding within some of the platforms there and the efforts that are being done to really mitigate that and move this project forward. Wanted to just get your general thoughts on where we're at right now with this information that we're finding out as well about some of the cracks in the structure as a whole, and your thoughts about where this project of the rail is right now.
Well, the cracks are concerning, obviously, and I don't want to diminish the importance of that. At the technical level, I'm not equipped to tell you exactly how big of a deal that is. But I will tell you that the fact that the recovery plan was accepted by the Federal Transit Administration, to me, means two important things. First, it means that some pretty smart people who do analysis on the question of transit and whether something is a viable project on the fiscal level, pretty smart people have said, okay, this works. So that doesn't mean that it'll definitely work out, but it does mean that it has passed the sniff test with the federal government. And they brought in independent consultants to kind of pressure test the analysis provided by HART and by the city and county of Honolulu. So I think that's a good indicator. And then the other pragmatic thing is that now that the recovery plan has been accepted, we get the flow of federal funds again. There are 3 tranches, we think, of $250 million each. And some of those dollars are going to start to flow to the project. And that's really important, not just for public confidence, but also because the project actually needs that money in order to pay for the final phases of construction.
Do you still have hopes that this will go to Ala Moana Center and beyond? Are you satisfied with it ending at this civic center, what they're calling, you know, in Kaka'ako, essentially?
Well, one thing at a time. Look, I believe in mass transit. And so I think that this project, if you're looking 30, 40 years out, it should go to Ala Moana, it should go to the University of Hawaii, and it should go wherever makes sense from a transit perspective. But I also understand that the public on Oahu and across the state of Hawaii has no appetite for imagining a new leg until we finish this leg. And so I kind of want to do first things first. Let's get this done. Let's have people ride it and see it and say, and that's what happened. That's what's happened in Salt Lake City and Denver and other places, which is people start skeptical. It tends to go over budget. It tends to take a little longer than you want it to. And then once the thing is operating, the opposite happens, which is people start to say, hey, I want my leg, right? And so, but we have to prove that we can execute on this first leg before we start talking about additional legs. In the abstract, from a sort of planning and transit standpoint, it absolutely makes sense to go to Ala Moana and to Manoa, but we're not going to get there unless we have the support of the people of Oahu. And right now, I think it's quite reasonable for any Oahu resident to go like, why don't you finish this first thing before you start making big plans for the next?
I want to switch gears again and talk about COVID-19. We have had the Department of Health officials on here. They were a little concerned about the number or the lack thereof of people who have been going out and getting this bivalent booster. We seemingly have moved on in our everyday lives. Not as many people wearing masks anymore, large gatherings once again. I'm wondering if you can share what the pulse is like on COVID-19 on a national level. Are those things that are still being talked about? Is there any worry about a winter surge? How have members of Congress, as well as the discussion overall on a national level, progressed with COVID-19 and our current state right now?
Well, on the national level, I think it's less masky than even Hawaii. In the Senate, people are just not wearing masks, except for people with specific sort of reasons to be concerned because of being immunocompromised or something like that. In the state of Hawaii, look, I think we've done generally well, but I think you've pointed out a problem, which is that people are kind of psychologically exhausted by all of this, and they're kind of like, we used to track exactly when we were eligible for the next booster. And I think even the most careful folks are like, wait, I was eligible? Oh my God, I got to get that scheduled. And so I think we're relaxing a little bit. And I think it's okay to be to integrate this into part of our lives and to, start to move on. But the best way to do that is to get vaccinated. There's a doctor online that I started to listen to, and he said, vax and chill. As long as you don't have some reason to be specifically concerned because you're immunocompromised or you have some other medical concern, vax and chill is not an entirely unreasonable way to look at this, which is get your vaccines whenever you can, probably still when you're in extremely crowded circumstances. You can wear a mask if that makes you feel more comfortable. But other than that, the best way to have your freedom back and to feel comfortable when you're, getting together with family and friends over Thanksgiving is to get that booster.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I know a lot of public health officials have talked about is that right now the barrier for a vaccine is fairly low in that it's free for the most part. Ingrid's got a question, which is Congress going to pass more funding for vaccines, et cetera? There is a concern that as you add more barriers, particularly cost, that even fewer folks will get that. Is there a conversation about that happening where you are?
Yes, we are pushing very hard in the next appropriations bill to do exactly that. Obviously, still the vaccine is free, but my own view is that the flu vaccine, the COVID vaccine, and even the monkeypox vaccine, all of those should be free to the public. And the reason is because to your point, if you establish a barrier for people to get the vaccine, they won't get the vaccine, and then you're going to have more disease circulating in society, and that doesn't save anybody a penny. And so this is a way to do public health and prevention, keep everybody safe, and reduce the overall cost to county, state, and federal government. So yes, we're working on it. The next appropriations bill, we hope, will pass in about a month, and we're hoping it'll have some money for to continue the policy of vaccines being free.
Well, we know that has become a contentious issue with Democrats and Republicans. It's just the overall, of course, COVID-19 response. But as a whole, we are seeing just a further division between both the left and right. And it's also playing out, in ways in which I know many people are disappointed. Obviously, the attack on the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, and just the crimes that have been happening and threats that are being made against public officials and those in office. I want to get your take on the climate right now as a country as we head into this important election tomorrow.
Well, look, politics is supposed to be a substitute for violence, right? Before politics, the way people settled all their disputes was whoever was stronger won the argument. And politics is supposed to replace violence, not be a precursor to it. And so what has happened recently, and I don't want to talk about it like it's inevitable and it's some, irreversible pattern, but I do think it's important to understand that when the spouses or the family of elected officials are in danger, that's not just terrible for those individuals. That's terrible for society overall. When I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee, when we talk to other countries who are allies or even adversaries, we oftentimes scold them about the rule of law and trying to make sure that their public officials, appointed or elected, are kept safe. Because if individuals are worried about their own safety as it relates to the decisions that they're making in public office, that tears at the very fabric of democracy. So this was a terrible incident. I'm glad he's on the mend. But we all, Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green, Aloha Aina, everybody should understand that, especially in the state of Hawaii, we all do live together, right? We all see each other at the supermarket or at the beach or wherever. And so we have to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. And certainly violence is never, ever, ever the answer.
I mean, our understanding of the individual who perpetrated this crime is that, he obviously was not well. And so do you see this as a one-off, or do you see this as an indication of the wider climate? And does this give you concern, in your own life? And do you think that members of Congress and people on the national stage should have more protection provided by the federal government?
Well, I feel protected. And the Capitol Police are always there whenever they are needed. Whenever there's a threat, they're there. The state sheriffs are always very helpful, HPD. And so I personally feel safe. Look, I think that this is a worrying sign, but I don't want to overstate the importance of one individual who obviously, sort of went deep into a rabbit hole on the internet and decided that Speaker Pelosi wasn't just someone with whom he disagreed, but someone who was sort of an enemy of America and all of that. We have to get out of that mentality where our political opponents are somehow tearing down the United States itself, and therefore must be dealt with accordingly. Politics is politics, and everybody who engages in politics ought to be able to fight hard, but that's with words and communications and ideas and nothing more than that.
Are you at all concerned about the elections, Shumar? I mean, the president has said that the structure as a whole, the democracy as a whole, is in jeopardy with election deniers and those who are running who will say that they will challenge election results if it doesn't come out in their favor. Knowing the importance of tomorrow's election and many who are worried about the response by those individuals who come up on the losing end, how worried are you? And is there any conversation that's happening internally within members of Congress right now about how they should go about on election night and receiving these results? If you can speak to that.
Well, I mean, sure. My job is to worry about things like this. So I definitely worry about this. I will say that on the Secretary of State jobs, right? These are people who administer elections. Right now, the election deniers are running pretty significantly behind in some of the key states. So that's at least somewhat reassuring. But certainly on the U.S. House and U.S. Senate side, we're going to have more election deniers and more people who at least have expressed a willingness to overturn the popular vote, the will of the people. Whether they will go through that, I don't know. I do not think, even if we lose the House and the Senate, that there is a critical mass to overturn federal elections. But it's worrying anytime people have that view and achieve power. It's not just that they're sort of saying, hey, we don't like these voting rules, and, sort of someone goes over the edge rhetorically. Some of these people are saying, hey, if my guy doesn't win, then it was stolen. And look, my candidate, hasn't won several times. I've never alleged that it was stolen. And so I think, again, it's incumbent on everybody to kind of keep their powder dry rhetorically. Tomorrow night's also an interesting challenge because Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada are unlikely to be resolved tomorrow night. Pennsylvania takes a while to count ballots. Nevada takes at least 3 or 4 days, and Arizona actually takes forever, up to a week. And so tomorrow, unless it's super obvious, like it's a red wave, then we might know by tomorrow night. Or if it's a blue wave, we might know by tomorrow night. But if it's anything in between, we're going to be sorting this out for the next, 3 to 5 days, maybe even up to 10 days. And sort of it's incumbent on all public officials, on all civically engaged citizens, and certainly the media to explain what's happening. Because I think the tendency for some is going to be to say, hey, we're ahead right now, stop counting, right? And that's not really how this works. If there are ballots that are valid and are cast, but just simply haven't been counted and take a little while to count, you can't invalidate them just because the state law in that particular state prohibits you from starting the counting until the election day is over.
You know, you mentioned Arizona over the weekend. Your former colleague, Tulsi Gabbard, was in Arizona campaigning for the candidate for governor there, Carrie Lake, who's obviously a Republican, a pretty staunch election denier herself. What are your thoughts about Tulsi Gabbard, you know, one of your former colleagues, now deciding that she's no longer a Democrat?
I have, she's a private citizen now, and she's not a member of the Hawaii congressional delegation, so we don't have occasion to talk or work together. But even when she was a member of the delegation, obviously she and I didn't agree on a bunch of different things, and I made it a pretty firm policy not to comment on her, and I'm not going to stray from that in this instance. But she's a private citizen and she's doing her thing.
You know, we are almost out of time, but as we look forward into the future, and we know that you have a lot on your plate, what are some of your biggest concerns or the things that you're going to be focusing on top of your agenda in the next few months as this year closes out and as we head into the new year?
Well, we have to get an appropriations bill done. It's been delayed a little bit, but the appropriations bill is really important to the state of Hawaii. There are a lot of good earmarks in there for local nonprofits, for government agencies that have really excellent projects. We've done really well in the first draft of the bill, but we have to finish this thing over the next month. And we also have to pass the National Defense Authorization Act. So we've got a pretty busy schedule over the next sort of 4 to 6 weeks. And the NDAA also will have some provisions regarding Red Hill. So a bunch to do over the holiday season.
Absolutely. Before we close out, we just love to get your final message to folks watching today. I always like to know what people are calling your office about, because I think it's such an interesting pulse on the concerns of your constituents. How has that changed in the last few months? And what's your final thought to our viewers this morning? Well,
I think people are very interested in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act. People are trying to figure out how they can participate in it. And the IRA in particular, there are a bunch of provisions where individuals can get up to $1,800 worth of tax credits for investments that will reduce their own energy consumption. So this isn't like big picture, 10 gigawatts of solar someplace. This is for your own home to reduce your energy load and reduce your utility bill. So people are trying to figure out how all of this works, and I'm pressing the IRS and the Department of Energy to get the word out about exactly how to participate in this. So I'm sensing a tiny bit of optimism, but it's mixed in with a deep amount of frustration about the cost of living, specifically the cost of gasoline.
All right, Senator Brian Schatz joining us this morning. Thank you so much for all the updates on the number of issues that we covered. We always appreciate you taking time to join us. So thanks so much.
Thanks to both of you.
Aloha. Well, great to hear from him. And we spent a lot of time at the top talking about Red Hill. The last time he was on, he actually had shared some information about the appointment of a person who would be in charge solely of Red Hill from the military's aspect. That, of course, became Rear Admiral John Wade, who he says he's very happy is now on the job and solely focused on that task. He seemed optimistic about the unpacking that has happened. But of course, that happened over the weekend, and that is just a small percentage of the overall fuel that needs to be drained. When we asked him about what should happen to that facility and this whole concept of closure in place, he said, let's not get the cart before the horse. His focus really is on getting those tanks defueled. And a large part of that will come down to money. What's it going to cost? He's pressing the Navy for some specifics on that so that he knows exactly how much to ask for in that upcoming appropriations that he talked about. Yeah, and we also heard his optimism about the rail project. We heard from him saying some very smart people decided that the plan before the FTA was a plan forward and that it made sense. And he expressed his appreciation for that, about that moving forward. And that optimism, saying that he believes that once people are able to get on the rail, to ride it, to experience it, that he understands that there is some hesitation now by some of the voters out there who have seen this project through for many, many years. But once people are able actually to ride, are able to ride on, the rail line, that they will
sort of grow to love this line and want it to enter in their community. And really, you can hear him saying, we have to just take it one thing at a time. Right now, the focus is getting it to Kaka'ako and the Civic Center, but moving forward, there may be other plans in the way. But the financial structure and the plan thus far looks to be in place and intact as they move into this critical phase for the rail.
Yeah, I thought it was also interesting how he talked about his work on the Indian Affairs Committee as chairman there and really amplifying the Native Hawaiian voice, saying that a large part of the hearings now include testimony from Native Hawaiians, which was not happening in years past. And also, he ticked off a big list of money that has been going to different programs throughout the state, and one that you had asked him about, which is the climate impact and what that's going to do for people in our community as well. So that was interesting. Of course, he is one of the 3 climateers, they call him in the Senate, someone who's really focused on climate change, talking a little bit about COP27, which is underway in Egypt right now. Always just so interesting to get his thoughts. We always cover such a wide range. And then, Ryan, you talked to him a lot about the political climate and the upcoming election tomorrow.
Yeah, the upcoming election tomorrow, which will, of course, impact us right here locally. Senator Schatz also on the ballot as well. Many here in the state have already voted, but remember, tomorrow is election day, so you need to get your ballots in to those drop box or to that election center by tomorrow. And we'll have a new governor, we'll have a number of new city council members, and so to kind of review all of that, that's going to be our focus on our next show on Wednesday.
Yeah, let's not forget reapportionment. Essentially, the whole legislature has been up for re-election, or perhaps some newcomers in that arena as well. So it'll be very interesting. Also, in the neighbor islands. So Neil Milner and Colin Moore, both political powerhouses, will be joining us. We always love to get their insights and what their hot takes are on all the races. We're going to be looking at a new legislature, 4 seats on the city council, and of course, as you mentioned, governor, lieutenant governor, and some other races throughout the state. So really looking forward to our conversation with Neil Milner and Colin Moore. We hope you join us right back here on Wednesday at 10:30.
We'll see you then. Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.